Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10, and I am going to begin the programme today with a topic for which I have no news-based source. Now, by that, I mean it is in the news, but it's not in the news in the way that I want to talk about it today. This is an extraordinarily courageous way to approach radio. I'm going to ask you a question, and I have no way of checking on your answers or even ensuring that they are relevant to the bigger picture that we seek to explore together. It is, yesterday, I don't know if you were listening. If you weren't, and that's not very nice, is it, frankly? I don't do this for my own amusement. But yesterday we were flirting with the idea of adding HS2 to the list of topics about which we will never talk again. There were some interesting moments during the course of the conversation and some interesting contributions, but it just seemed for a while to be veering into, sort of parking tickets and smart motorways territory. And I found myself thinking there are reasons why we don't do these conversations. We don't take 10 calls in succession, which are all completely interchangeable and identical. And then everything improved, thankfully. Partly for surreal reasons, with reference to the Romans. I don't know if you heard that. That was a marvellous contribution from Raymond in Uxbridge, suggesting that we should have built HS2 according to the Roman road method of traversing nations. And other contributors were similarly informed. So we're going to talk about it again today, but not in the way that you might expect. Because the more I've looked at this story, the more I have found myself marvelling at how much it is costing. And it is a sense of wonder leavened by familiarity. I don't really like narratives of us being really bad at stuff. The bad things about this country have been deliberately or accidentally inflicted upon us. There's nothing in our DNA or in our waters, literally, of course, these days, that is by necessity and by definition suboptimal or bad. Our waters are filthy because of people and individuals and institutions pumping shocking amounts of sewage into them. The ability to export, the difficulties of exporting to our nearest markets have been put in place by politicians who promise to remove red tape. There is nothing sort of fundamentally or inherently British about decline and damage, but there does seem to be about cost. Whenever a massive public project is announced in this country, it always seems to cost a hell of a lot more than they told us it would. And indeed, I think, and this is where I have done what we might laughably describe as some research, it always seems to cost a hell of a lot more than it would in other countries. Now, there are things relevant to HS2 that are specific to Britain. We're a particularly built-up country. I mean, there's lots of areas of the country that aren't built up. I think there's more of the United Kingdom covered in golf course than there is in housing. But when you want to put a railway between towns and cities, then you're going to have to build in towns and cities. And that, of course, is incredibly costly. But I don't think any of these specifics explain why building infrastructure in the UK costs far more than in most other places, okay? So France opened a 188-mile stretch of its high-speed network in 2017. It cost, in today's money, it cost £46 million per mile, okay? £46 million per mile. The HS2 at the moment, per mile of track, is knocking at the door of £396 million per mile. I mean, this is the stuff. No wonder they're desperate to talk about refugees again. This is the stuff of what is it the stuff of? It's the stuff of wonder. You would imagine, wouldn't you, that somebody might be pointing this out in a slightly louder voice than we can muster on this little radio entertainment. £396 million, 400 million quid a mile, give or take. Some loose change. £400 million a mile to build HS2, hop over La Manche, swim across the English Channel to France, and high-speed rail per mile. It's a high-speed rail network. There might be some differences, but they won't account for this. In a figure adjusted for inflation, so in today's money, and this is a calculation undertaken by, I think, one of the most valuable contributors to public discourse in this country, John Byrne-Murdoch of the Financial Times, in France, it cost 46 million per mile. In Britain, 396 million per mile. In France, 46 million. And there it is. Just over a tenth as much. And it took 12 years to deliver from the start of planning to the trains actually running. HS2 anticipated for the same initial phase, to take 23 years. So it's taking twice as long and costing 10 times as much. HS2 specifically. Steve has already been in touch with a question that's possibly better than the one I was going to ask you. He says, one question, James, where the hell is that money going? It's a very good question, Steve. I live in a city, where Boris Johnson spent tens of millions of pounds on a bridge without a single brick ever being laid. And then he became Prime Minister after that. Such is the nature of our country. Such is the nature of the relationship between right-wing media getting very, very worried today about people not being able to afford their school fees. But, of course, people who can't afford food or energy bills or shampoo, they're just a bunch of feckless, work-shy scumbags who should, frankly, just get another job or take culinary advice from 30p Leenock. But the idea that Boris Johnson could spend tens of millions of pounds on a bridge that not only doesn't exist, but doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. It's not like half a bridge, which is what Rishi Sunak is keen to turn HS2 into, like sort of the equivalent of building half a bridge and claiming that half a bridge is better than no bridge. There's not like, I don't know if you've been to London recently, but it's not as if you can walk down to Embankment and see the beginnings of an abandoned bridge, like an abandoned garden bridge. Oh, look, there it is. Everyone's come down from Stockport to come and see the abandoned bridge. There's the abandoned bridge there. Oh, imagine if it had been built and it was going to be a garden bridge. It was going to be a bridge with a garden on it. 52 billion? Million, not billion. Don't relax, all right. Million, was it? 52, 35 million? I forget. Most of it ours. Most of it our money. Some of it private. But they didn't lay a single brick. They spent tens of millions of pounds without a single blade of spade breaking a single inch of London clay. And we sit here going, oh yeah, 400 million quid per mile of HS2. Where does it go? And listen, this is representative of a wider pattern. If you look at a dozen major rail projects, all adjusted for inflation, you're looking at about £262 million per mile in this country. Japan has something called a bullet train network. It's a rather good Brad Pitt film set on a bullet train, actually. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's a jolly good film. It may even be called Bullet Train. Is it called Bullet Train? I think it's even called Bullet Train. I enjoyed it enormously. They have brought in their per mile network for £145 million. So, again, £100 million per mile less than what we are paying. In Sweden, it's absolutely record-breaking 92. Well, I say record-breaking, it's not. £92 million per mile in Sweden, £74 million per mile in Italy, £42 million per mile in France, and £34 million in Germany. This is across a dozen different projects. So you can get a figure for a specific project and then you can get the average for that country. Roads are the same. New motorway bridges in the UK cost more than 3 times as much per lane per mile than they do in France, Denmark or Norway. If you want to put an additional lane on an existing road, it will cost you twice as much here as it does in Germany. In America, it's even higher, which may be relevant. It may be pertinent. I don't know. We shall see. And that, I've got more as well. I've got graphs. Of all the things that don't work on the radio, is there anything more apposite than graphs? Anything more apposite than graphs except, I don't know, facial expressions? Facial expressions don't work on the radio, but this show is available on YouTube now. I've developed a terrible habit of looking straight down the camera whenever I remember the YouTube show. It's going to be quite spooky. Don't let your children near it. YouTube! It's sort of curiously like a moth to a flame. But I've got some graphs that look at high-speed rail, new tram lines, the electrification of existing rail, new road tunnels, new motorway bridges, and new road lanes. And with the exception of America on quite a lot of these measures, and this might be part of the answer to the question that I'm about to ask you, The most obvious comparisons with countries like France, Germany, Japan, we are miles and miles and miles ahead of them on how much it costs. Do you know what? We're practically world-beating on paying money hand over fist for infrastructure that other countries manage to provide at a fraction of the cost that we pay. And it's useful to use France and Germany as examples because none of the weirdos and liars are going to be able to claim that it's somehow a consequence of having to follow European Union regulations or rules. Or I notice they've gone very, very quiet at the moment. I'll ask you a question in a minute, just a little bit of business first. I don't normally do this sort of thing, but something about Tanya in Westminster's message caught my eye. She says, from one O'Brien to another, please could you let my husband know I love him muchly. It's our 21st wedding anniversary today, so please could you thank Jason for being a wonderful husband with whom I am looking forward to spending another long and colourful stretch. Yes, I can, and congratulations to Tanya and Jason on their 21st wedding anniversary. But the question that I would rather you focused on today, as opposed to requests for shout-outs, as I believe the kids call them. The question is this. Why? 0345 6060 973. I'll do it again now in a slightly different tone of voice. Why? 0345 6060 973. Why does it cost so much more money here to build stuff than it does almost everywhere else? Brackets except America, dash, possibly relevant, close brackets. Why? And listen, I'd rather, at least to begin with, that we left the Romans out of it. And also, you must know what you're talking about to start with. I like to feel that I have covered the don't know what we're talking about bases fairly clearly. I've given you some numbers. I've given you some comparisons. These are not opinions. These are facts. They are figures. They are undisputed. But they do not address the question of why. Why does building, we'll start with railways, but infrastructure in general, why does it cost so much more to do it in the United Kingdom than it does almost anywhere else? And I'll take whatever answers you've got. And if you've worked on projects like this, then you might know. I think if I were to get political for a moment, I would suggest that you need good governance to bring in projects like this. In other words, you need big government. You need a big state. You need governance. You need public figures, civil servants watching and managing and keeping an eye on things rather than just letting the private sector run off and spend whatever they want on whatever they want. But I stress again, I don't know what I'm talking about. So that may just be wrong. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. What's it going to be? Hospitals, a lot of you sending me figures regarding hospitals. Why does building infrastructure cost so much more in this country than it does in other comparable and nearby economies? 0345 6060 973. 19 minutes after 10 is the time. And there's another graph, actually, that looks at the quality of service for cities when it comes to public transport. Britain's cities are more poorly served by public transport than those of any other wealthy Western country, including the US, which comes in a close second. This all comes from OECD, functional urban areas with population above 250,000 research undertaken by John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times. But it is the graph that looks at everything from railways to tram lines, from road lanes to motorway bridges, and for our purposes this week in the UK, high-speed rail that really begs the question, why does it cost so much more here than it does in other countries? Let's start with Michael, who's in Kings Lynn. Michael, what have you got?
Hello.
Hello.
So I've worked on a lot of government projects, right from military, right through to treatment plants, all sorts of different things. And unless it's got a very good manager on there who can cut through the red tape, these projects just go massively overboard because they put so many hurdles in front of themselves.
Like what?
Just paperwork stuff. So.
Well, this is going well. I think that's the communications infrastructure in the country letting us down there. I don't know whether it was brought in under budget, over budget, or with no budget at all. It is, as I say, the comparisons with other countries that are absolutely staggering, and phrases like red tape, not necessarily helpful without specific detail. Frank's in Manchester. Frank, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James.
Hello, Frank.
I am going back now 22 years. I was an ex-railway surveyor made redundant on privatisation.
Okay.
I popped up in the private consultancy world doing compulsory purchase because the particular company involved had taken on a section of the M60 where there were 32,000 Part 1 compensation cases.
Right.
Part 1 is where you own property close to a new piece of public infrastructure, but you don't have any property taken. You can put in a claim for compensation.
Okay.
And like I say, there were 32,000 of these. I'd never done Part 1 in my life. Can I help? So, of course, roll your sleeves up and you go. And I realised that it had the intellectual quotient of shelling peas. There was no skill to it at all.
Right.
After about a week, I asked my chief, is there a budget for this?
Yeah.
And he looked at me blank. And I said, I've stood on enough mats in front of enough secretaries of state to know that somebody somewhere has put a budget on this. What is it?
Yeah.
Oh, can you give us a budget?
So you've got 36,000 people waiting for compensation, and nobody anywhere has put a number on what the total is likely to be.
Well, not in that consultancy anyway. Anyway, I very rapidly compiled a budget.
Yeah.
£180 million.
Million?
£180 million.
Yeah.
Cue backsides running for cover in every direction.
Right. What are you telling me? Listen, I need the edited version, Frank. What are you telling me?
I know this is the trouble because it's fairly complex. It's not.
No, don't talk to me like I'm stupid. Well, you're telling me that they don't know how much compensation they're going to have to pay when they announce the project. So there's a massive hole.
In that case, yes.
Right, fine.
But,
well, that would work for HS2, wouldn't it? Because that was one of the first stories we started hearing was all about compulsory purchases and things like. It would be quite hard to put a figure on stuff like that. But what do they do in other countries? Do we know?
I have no idea because I kept the argument within this country. But when we looked at it, I then realised that branches of the same consultancy were doing different things around the country.
Yeah.
So I asked for a conference, which was refused, and we ended up with a whole hour on the telephone. But I managed to identify the fact that if you look at it like a slice of orange peel, 20% bang up on the boundary,
right?
0 at the point where you can no longer hear the new motorway, runway, whatever it is.
So we give too much compensation.
What was happening here, they took a straight line from the top to the bottom.
Right.
Whereas other offices were making it look like an orange peel section, 20% on the front line, dropping like a stone,
right,
and then zeroing out to the distance.
Not an orange peel, an orange segment.
An orange segment. And everything within that segment was wasted.
You just threw me. I'm sitting here drawing orange peel, Frank. And you mean an orange segment? You mean a pyramid?
I'm sorry, I do. I'm being thick, James.
No, you're not being thick, Frank. You're just you got your orange peel mixed up with your orange segments, and you've thrown the whole thing into disarray, mate.
But basically, every pound that comprised that segment was wasted public money.
And so this is going to be part of it, and albeit your experience is specific to a different project. It is on my graph. I've got new roads, new motorway bridges. So the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing would be one way of putting it.
I got the chance to move on to a new scheme with another. This was a local authority that hadn't even been started.
Right.
It was a tiny scheme, 3.2 million, but it was virgin. So I rolled my sleeves up. And I did the assessment. There was £3.2 million worth of claims in.
Right.
And I worked out the assessment at 110,000 quid.
Gosh.
So I called in the claimants' surveyors, stood them in the middle of the road that had been diverted.
Yes.
And after 10 minutes, told them they'd all lost the claims because if they'd stood there 2 years ago, they'd have been mown down by an 18-wheeler.
You're veering again, which is fine. So, in answer to Steve's question, which I think is better than mine, where did all the money go? Did it? I'm still not quite clear. And don't mention oranges.
The money went in overpayment of compensation.
Okay, that's interesting. And you're never going to find anyone complaining about that unless we get lucky and you ring in, because no one's ever going to ring in and say, I got far too much compensation for my house.
Well, like I say, in this case, I reduced a £3.2 million compensation bill to 110,000 quid, basically by putting me toe in the door and saying...
No, okay. No. And that's you acting autonomously, really. I mean, there's no one... You're not getting a slap around the chops from your boss, metaphorically speaking, if you don't do that. And in fact, if everyone else is failing to do it, you probably become a bit of a troublemaker on the team. And it's like, oh, Frank, wind your neck in, will you? The rest of us are just phoning it in. So that's not going to explain all of it, but it's going to be perhaps part of it. And how does the... situation get addressed? How do you improve that? Or how do you know how widespread it is? Why in France are you paying roughly a tenth of what you're paying here for a mile of high-speed rail network? It can't just be because of the way that compensation works, but if it is part of it, then I want to know more. 03456060973. An awful lot of you are getting in touch to tell me that Stanley Johnson benefited from a compensation scheme, Boris Johnson's father, but I don't know that would account for all of the shortfall or difference between building high-speed rail networks here and building them elsewhere in the world. Thank you, Frank. Staying up north. Simon's in Leeds. Simon, what do you want to say? I'll take anything you've got on this. It's an absolute blooming mystery.
I've been in construction all my life, James. From being 16, I'm 56 now. I drive cranes. That's what I do for a living.
Oh, mate, one day.
The big ones in the sky is what I do.
Is it it as enjoyable as it looks?
Oh, it's fantastic.
Do you love your work?
Lovely shots of it. Yeah, absolutely adore it, mate.
I bet you do.
I've seen some beautiful dawns and some fantastic sunsets.
I can well believe it. I don't know why.
I get views of cities that people paid for.
Yes, I know. And, well, most of us will never see it, except perhaps out of an aeroplane window, and that'll be 10 times further away than you. There's something about cranes that speak to something in my soul, Simon.
Well, my grandfather was a crane driver. That's why I drive cranes myself.
Fantastic. I wanted to do the show up one once, but they couldn't get the insurance.
No, because they move about a bit, you see, and people tend to get a bit frightened that I've not been up before, you know.
Oh, that's right. Anyway, that's not what you rang in for. Why does it cost so much?
It's the big C word, James. It's the big C word. It's vested interest as well.
That's
the government. The government do not use.
You mean consultancies or corruption?
Well, that one, the second one. I don't like to use that in a public space. You know what I mean? There could be ramifications. You know what I mean?
Yes, go on. Tell me more.
But basically, they don't use civil servants. Civil servants just kind of write stuff off. They just look at stuff. You know what I mean? Bits and bobs.
Yeah.
They use private consultancies. These private consultancies work with the same old construction companies that do all the work.
Yes. So they don't.
The hospitals. They build the roads.
No, you do, and we can all name the companies.
And they're all involved in the blacklist of trade unions. They're all, you know what I mean? They're all in that. And you look at who they fund, who they donate to.
Well, we know who they donate to because one of the loudest voices complaining about HS2 being called off was the fellow that owns JCB, although we're not obviously suggesting any malfeasance on the part of any individuals or named individuals or institutions. But for people who don't know, how does that work? So an army of consultants come in.
Basically, the planning goes out, the planning permission goes out, what have you, so they get consultants in there.
Right. Yeah.
So they get a big, I can't name the company, there's one company that does...
No, don't name anybody, just talk in very loose terms. Talk in loose terms.
But they come in, do the planning consultancy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then it's passed on to a consultancy within that consultancy that does the construction side of it.
But what you
have is you've got the same major construction.
No, I know I understand that, but so everybody knows that they're massively inflating budgets, and
absolutely,
and no one does anything about it.
No, but nobody cares.
Because why would you? Everyone's laughing.
Why would you? We're all getting paid.
Everyone's laughing.
We're all getting paid.
But this is Great Britain. I thought this would happen in Italy with the mafia and things. This is happening in Leeds.
We have a quote. Well, what's the quote from Al Capone? There's no such difference between government and gangsters.
Yeah.
One and the same.
Did he say that? It's very clever.
That's a Capone quote, allegedly. A Facebook Capone quote.
A Facebook Capone quote. I love it. So, I mean, I feel like we're nibbling at the edges of answers to this question, but obviously part of the question then becomes, what is unique to this country? You're suggesting that we've got more of the C's, whether it's corruption or consultancies, vested interests. We've got more of it going on here than anywhere else, except
Absolutely.
America, which would make sense, oddly, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's the same in America. It's the same in the States. It's the same major construction players that do all the work.
And it makes no difference who's in power, because...
that makes no difference, because that's the cost.
Well, this is a uniquely depressing conversation.
That's what you'll pay.
This is a uniquely depressing conversation, isn't it? And in your game, everybody knows. It's like the biggest, worst-kept secret in the world.
Everybody in construction knows. And even kind of, like, you mean, the British Library was the great example. The British Library was the first major one that went massively over. I know guys that worked on that, a lot of guys that worked on that. And so they brought in, after the British Library, a set of regulations called the Construction Design and Management Regulations, CDMs.
Right.
Yeah. Which was supposed to negate that. Yeah.
It didn't work.
So it was supposed to negate. Well, the reason it was. Well, no, because what it brought in was the advent of consultants.
Oh, I see. So you need to bring a consultant in to make sure you're not going over cost.
Boom.
But then you go over cost. No one ever gets fired. Well, I tell you what, Simon, that is an absolute revelation for me. And it's not going to be the whole of the answer to the question. And obviously, it's a little bit simplistic just to keep hitting that figure in France, where it costs just under a tenth or just over a tenth per mile for building a high-speed railway of what it costs here. But you've got a disparity that big. You take any answer going. This is incredible stuff, and there's more to come. It's 10:33. Lottie Morley has your headline. 10:37 is the time. Loads of text coming in. Apologies that I will only be able to read out some of them, but this seems pertinent from B. The UK has a massive skills shortage and deficit, making it impossible to deliver complex infrastructure projects effectively. Under this 13-year Conservative government, there has been a failure to invest in skills, project planning, project management, procurement, consultancy management, and infrastructure delivery. Private sector consultants run rings around government and extract public funds. This Tory government also seems happy to overpay their donor mates and waste public funds. It doesn't help with this Tory government slagging off civil servants and managers all the time rather than investing in skills improvement. I'll take that, B, but I would add that when Labour are in power, I don't think that these massive infrastructure projects come in any quicker or cheaper. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. The Severn Bridge, Siva tells us, came in 1967. It was on time and on budget. About £8 million. So something has changed. Of course, we should always mention the rise of the secretly funded think tanks operating on behalf of big business, vested interests, quite possibly construction companies paying their wages. They won't tell us who does pay their wages, but they are, of course, responsible for the idea that we should have less state, less government, and rely more on private sector. And arguably, this massive HS2 overspend is what happens when you put everything in the hands of the private sector. 10:38 is the time. Tony is in Abergavenny. Tony, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, Jane.
Hello, Tony.
Yeah, and it's only might be part of the reason,
yes.
As I understand it. In France, their droit administratif is their way of controlling these things. What they do is they have a survey put out, and this is very simplified. They decide on a route, and then they listen to a few local bits and pieces, then they give out, everybody gets a letter and compensation and the date that the bulldozers move in. Whereas we tend to have days and weeks of hearings, then there's appeals, then there's sort of call-ins and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
They don't bother with that. They
so
that's the route.
I mean, in a way, that's quite tricky, isn't it? Because you don't paint a picture of the French system that many people would be envious of. The idea that
exactly, but
it drops through your letterbox, and it drops through your letterbox, and a week on Tuesday they knock your house down.
Yeah, it's a bit like was it Hitchhikers, wasn't it?
Yes, it is exactly like that. It's exactly.
But, yeah, it's very simplified, and if somebody else wants to ring in with a bit further, better in particular.
No, but you've got experience of France, have you? So that's what you're drawing on.
I was a departmental lawyer, and I did a lot with European law, and I worked in town and country planning for a while before I joined the police.
No, fair enough. I mean, it's obviously going to come as a bit of a shock to everyone that thinks we all obey the same laws and that they are imposed upon us from Brussels, but that would be a pertinent contributor to the problem. It's not a phone-in where someone's going to ring in and nail the whole thing. You're looking at a reason why it costs 10 times more here than it does in France. There's going to be loads of contributory factors, but the idea that we have a more costly planning process and a more complicated planning process because we set a little bit more store by ownership seems not just plausible, but also deeply, deeply pertinent. I'm now being told that the Severn Bridge was built and owned by the French, which just sort of makes you wonder why we don't get them to do everything. If they're doing it, unfortunately, bloody Brexit. But if they're doing it for a fraction of the cost in France, why don't we just get the French companies to come here and do it? I'm being glib, but not necessarily stupid. Thank you, Tony. Diane's in Tottenham. Diane, what would you like to say?
I'd like to talk about the Dutch polder model, which in the Netherlands and to some extent in other European countries, the government owns the land. So some of this about the way in which projects are developed and run is often because we see public-private partnerships here in the UK as the private sector will always deliver.
Yes.
In the Dutch system, because the government owns about owns most of the land, so people are really surprised because they think that the Dutch system it wouldn't work here. But if the government owns the land, it invites the private sector to obviously to deliver projects like, for example, their high-speed line. It was bizarre because I was travelling to and from the Netherlands for work, and in 1997 they agreed to build a high-speed line to link the Netherlands with, and it was delivered by 2009. After a 2-year delay, which the Dutch were so wound up about. How can it be delayed by 2 years?
How does the ownership side of it work? Because I don't know much about Holland. So the large swathes of the country are owned by the state, as it were, whereas everything here is owned by, bloody aristocrats again, isn't it?
Yes. Exactly. It's it's capitalism in another form.
But you own your house in Holland, don't you? You own. People own a field or something.
Absolutely, farmers own it. But the point is that the development value, what's called the development value, accrues to the state rather than to individuals. So what that means is that after the Second World War, and regeneration needed to happen, the government took control of land and development. And what the government does for owning the land is it prepares. Remember that most of the Netherlands is underwater if we didn't have dikes.
Yes.
Then they prepare land for development. So the government prepares land for development. And if, for example, in their high-speed line, they invited a consortium of the private sector to come up with plans to deliver it at a cost that they would have to agree to. But any increase in the value around that, around the line, went to the government, which meant that they could reinvest in other infrastructure.
Okay, I think I understand. And that again adds to the picture that we're getting of a strangely sclerotic country. But if I understand you correctly, Diane, this is all the fault of the Norman conquest.
Yeah. Well, it could be, yes.
So I was giving Raymond a hard time yesterday for bringing the Romans into it, but it turns out the Normans are to blame.
They certainly are, because of our pattern of land ownership.
Because we carved it all up and gave it to William the Conqueror's mates.
We certainly did. And in the Dutch model, remember, it's called the Dutch polder model, if anyone wants to look it up.
Polder.
But because the Dutch, the Dutch polders is about how they make their own land. The Dutch make their own land.
Of course they do, Well, to be fair, so do a lot of East Anglia. So
but the point being that the Dutch realised I would argue it goes back hundreds of years, but particularly since the Second World War, that unless they built the dikes, the Netherlands would be. Would you trust a private company to
build a dike? No, I wouldn't. No, and this notion of ownership, of course, is going to be tied up in history. I'm not even being silly when I talk about the Normans. You're looking at a country where everything is owned by a tiny, tiny number of people. So you want to build a railway right through the middle of it, then you're going to be dealing with ownership issues. And the fact that we've got a royal family, they own huge swathes of the country. They own it in a way that some governments, it would seem, can, if not supersede, then at least bypass. This is fascinating stuff, Dutch polder system. Thank you, Diane. So, there you've got a problem of undoing it. You probably couldn't undo it. I wonder how much money goes to landowners in the UK for having a railway built through their land compared to in France or indeed Holland, if indeed you can make a straight comparison. 10:45 is the time. Thank you for your recommendations on further listening and reading. One that I am already aware of, or certainly someone I am already aware of, is an Irish economist called David McWilliams, who does a brilliant podcast. He also organises the Dorky Book Festival, which is an absolute jewel in the... It's one of the main reasons why I still write books, is so that I can go to the Dorky Book Festival. And I'll be going next summer with the new one. Just a tiny bit too late for this year's. But he's got a podcast, the David McWilliams podcast. As an economist, I think he was one of the first people, one of that tiny number of people who saw the 2008 financial crisis coming. But he talks about the necessity of taking back control of public infrastructure projects. They need to be under the remit of the state, because if they're not in the control of the government, then who is keeping an eye on things? I know it sounds odd, but the alternative is what we've got going on here. And the countries that are bringing in these projects at a fraction of the cost that we pay are countries where the state has a much tighter grip on proceedings than it does here. And if you think that sounds odd, then just wonder why it sounds odd in Britain, in a country where the Tory government and the rancid think tank ecosystem and the right-wing media is constantly telling us that the civil service is bad, that the blob is bad, that we should be trusting more in private sector, give it all to the business. It's actually bonkers when you look at the success of the con. We're so far down the road that we can't even see the ends of our own noses anymore. What is the answer to a lot of these problems? Well, the answer is to have more investment in the state, a state infrastructure. Governance is the word that you want. Good governance. Keeping an eye on these projects rather than saying we shall outsource it. We shall outsource it to the private sector. So I'll retweet the link to that particular podcast. And I'd remind you that for all the talk of the Norman Conquest and the Dutch model, this doesn't just apply to building stuff. Indeed, as this text from Simon reminds us, pretty much every IT project instigated by the government goes over budget and over timetable, often spectacularly so. I think there was an NHS computer system, wasn't there? And he says, just look at the COVID test and trace, £37 billion for a barely functional system. So it's not going to be the nature of property ownership that explains the bulk of this. It's going to be the relationship between public and private sector, I think. Hayley is in East Grinstead. Hayley, what would you like to say?
Firstly, honour to speak to you, James. I've been trying for such a long time.
You're very kind, so you really are. But it's going to be a huge anticlimax for you. Let me apologise in advance.
Well, I'll apologise in advance as well then.
Thanks.
Okay,
yes.
So I've spent years working in IT, and I just wanted to use that as an analogy.
Yes.
Construction and stuff. Want to buy a new warehouse system. Before now, we've just written it all ourselves, so it does exactly what we want it to do.
Right.
Okay, great. Get a new system, talk to a couple of suppliers, bring one in. Yeah, we love this system. We want this one. But we're not going to change how we do things. We want you to recode this system over here, and you end up with hundreds, maybe thousands of little customizations to make it work exactly how you want it to work. So it costs 3 times the amount of money.
So it's constantly going up. This is sort of reappraisal, I think it's called. It's built into the business model, but somehow the customers don't realise. That's the bit that confuses me. You'd think that once one person had pulled off something like this, then next time you order something, you're going to be on tiptoes, making sure it doesn't happen again.
Yes. So convert that to a construction thing.
Yep.
And being British, this is how we want to do it. We're not going to change how we want to do it.
It's a bit of exceptionalism, you think?
I think possibly.
Yeah, I do too now. You put it like that.
Raymond's idea yesterday. Sorry.
Yeah. No, what?
Instead of digging up half of Euston.
No, don't encourage him. There's no earthly way that HS2 should have been built like Watling Street.
No, not necessarily Watling Street, but maybe not dig up half of Euston and the surrounding areas and whatever else area we need to. Maybe there was a different or a better way.
Yeah, you've spoilt it now. It was going really well, but the point about digging up Euston is that's already got a railway line to Birmingham. So if you're going to go from London to Birmingham, from Manchester to London to Birmingham, you have to go through the bit that was already going to Birmingham, I think, or something like that. But what you're saying about this sort of built-in reappraisal, constant reappraisal, would be because the consultancies and the private private sector. I mean, there's a modicum of trust. There's an issue of trust here. So I hire you to come in and do something. It doesn't cross my mind that your top priority is rinsing me for as much money as you humanly can. But it is.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I suspect our European and Asian cousins maybe don't have this kind of, this is the best way to do it. Let's do it this way. And
well,
next
also,
time
they
we
don't.
do another one.
Yes, of course. We won't learn
You know,
anything from the mistakes we made last time. And they've also got, they haven't got, almost all of the media essentially shilling for big businesses. The main governing party for the last 13 years, literally in the pocket of the kind of donors who are profiting enormously from the kind of projects that you describe. The JCB bloke kicking off about the potential cooling of time on HS2 suddenly appears rather different from how it did at first glance. Hayley, thank you. I hope that lived up to your lofty expectations. Thank you for your lovely words. 10:55 is the time. Pete's in Bristol. Pete, what have you got?
Hi, James. How are you doing?
Very well, Pete.
Sorry to take you off loudspeaker. So my dad and my sister both work in infrastructure, like national infrastructure projects. So I'm not an expert on this.
That's all right. No one is. And the ones that are won't tell us because they're the ones that are laughing all the way to the bank.
Exactly. So one of them's in communications, the other one's a lawyer.
Well, are you making a cake at the moment? Have you got a food mixer going on in the background?
No, just a kettle. I thought I'd have more warning before I came on national radio.
You put the kettle on. You got the kettle on while you're talking to me.
I thought your producer might come back and
That's
say...
That's absolutely ridiculous. Turn the kettle off this minute.
It is off. It is
there,
off.
now carry on.
Nothing in the background.
Thank you. Milk and 2 sugars, please.
So communications and law, and they both work for private companies.
I might just make a sandwich, actually. You just carry on talking. All
right. So they work for private companies, and the main client is the Department for Transport.
Yeah.
And they both take home quite good salaries for what in other countries I think would just be civil servants doing those jobs on a kind of set salary.
So it's outsourcing it, and presumably the bigger the project, the fewer companies there are that can be bidding for it anyway.
That's the nub of it.
Yeah.
That's really where it is. There's very few companies that can actually compete for these projects because they're so large.
And so we call them in and tell them to write their own bill.
Yeah, and when people talk about red tape in other countries, I don't know if they've ever dealt with red tape in other countries, but I've lived for a bit in Germany, and the bureaucracy there is insane. It is very difficult to get stuff done. I found it worse there than here, on a different sort of level, but I don't think it's red tape. I think it's
not
to do with outsourcing.
It's follow the money, Pete. Follow the money, and then you'll probably find your answers. And that's why Steve's question at the outset was the killer question to us. Where does all the money go? And the answer is to the companies that are doing the work. And are they going to complain about being over budget and over schedule? No, of course they're not. The longer over schedule it goes, the longer they get paid for, and the higher over budget it goes, the more money they get. I found this a really surreal experience. I can't believe we've never touched on it before. Thank you, Pete. Brian's in Milton Keynes. Brian, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Just along the lines of where does the money go?
Yes.
Very basically, in my view, there's two forms of contract. Construction contract. Cost reimbursement or fixed fee.
Yeah.
Fixed fee is when you've got something fully designed. Picture a house. Your house is fully designed. There you go. From that, you derive a bill of quantities, which tells you each item. Cost reimbursement is the opposite. You really haven't got a clue what you want, but you want something to go in and make a start, ASAP. And I think that's the key. It's more, to get a true comparison, you would need a reasonable amount of design done first with things like some bills of quantity. So where did we overrun? Yes, there's a contingency in there for and that's what I think we're missing. But where is the visibility? What was the initial design? What was it based on? And
well, you're trusting the consultants on this. You do, because there's no one in the civil service that's got the expertise to do it anymore. Those days are gone, really. The I don't know whether it's austerity or ideology, but the idea that you'd have, local councillors and not councillors, but people working for councils, it's all being outsourced. All of it is outsourced to the private sector, so they're marking their own homework at every turn.
It is, but if you had something a bit more regimented,
also,
James,
yes, I agree with you. I agree. I think you're making perfect sense. I'd go further, Brian, and you tell me how plausible this is. But when we've got builders in, if they should suffer if things go wrong. They should make less money.
Exactly. sorry, James, it's about apportioning risk.
Yes, exactly.
So
that's the phrase I'm looking for.
If it comes in here that, okay, well, and that should be in the contract, to a certain extent, because that's what the contracts are, an apportionment risk. If it's lump sum,
so they're going to get their backsides in gear, aren't they? If it looks like it's going to be running late, they're going to get their backsides in gear. Lose some of the profit by paying overtime, so everyone's working through the night under arc lights, but it's going to come in on budget, because if it doesn't, it's going to cost us a hell of a lot more than it's going to cost us to make sure that it does.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, it is, you see. So, it's a very strange old business, this, isn't it? And the figures, when you look at it, comparing just the UK to France or to Germany or to Japan, are absolutely staggering. And yet, the UK public is being encouraged to get cross about all sorts of other things, not really about this. I don't know what was the actual figure on the Garden Bridge, because I think it's a really helpful illustration. Over £60 million, I think, of promised public money. I'm just trying to remember exactly how much was spent. But if you can preside over that, this is the United Kingdom and how they get away with it, not where does the money go. Boris Johnson can spend tens of billions of pounds on a vanity project that doesn't get built. And such is the nature of supine client journalism in this country that it's not even a bump in the road on his path to Prime Minister. It's 4 minutes after 11 now. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I should give you a quick heads up. We're going to have another one of our AI conversations at some point this week, possibly today, possibly not. I haven't decided yet. But do you remember when we sort of said it's going to kick off? It's going to be like that law about microprocessors. They will double in capacity and shrink in size exponentially. AI, even Rishi Sunak is warning about it. Two things drawing my attention to it. An incredible story involving Stephen Fry, which I saw earlier this week. I saw it last week. Because he recorded all of the Harry Potter books, his voice is there. And AI can therefore kind of make it sound as if he's voiced almost anything. I think he found a history documentary that was essentially being narrated in his voice that he had absolutely nothing to do with. And another example of it, I saw Satnam Sanghera, the journalist and rather brilliant author. I'm delighted to say he's hosting my event in Birmingham in November for the new book. But Satnam finding that AI is being trained using his books without his permission as a database where millions of hours of authors' work is being exploited by big tech with zero payment to the writers. So there's a lot going on. And we said we'd have fairly regular catch-ups. And I would abandon my traditional habit of almost celebrating my own ignorance. And I did it again yesterday, not on the show, thankfully, but off air. I said, what's that? What's the difference between Google Docs and Google Notes? And my colleague said, well, Google Notes is essentially a spreadsheet. I said, you've lost me. I've got to stop. You've got to stop doing that, being almost like proud of how things you don't know about. It's a stupid condition. It starts with maths, doesn't it? It starts at school where you think it's not cool to be good at maths because you're all creative, man. It's absolutely nuts, that approach. And never too old to change. So that's on my list of things that I need to change. Now, I don't know if you're going to change my mind on the next subject. Let me get the rather obvious political points out of the way. There is something truly hideous, stroke hilarious. I don't know, is there a German word for something that's simultaneously hideous and hilarious? But you know the kind of 30p Lennox school of compassion, where if someone tells you they can't afford food, you attack them. Or if someone tells you they can't afford basic essentials, anyone who's ever been to a food bank will know that they value things that aren't food at least as highly as things that are, if not more so. Cleaning products for both body and house, body and home, are at an absolute premium in food banks. Our Morrison's does a wonderful scheme where you can see what's in the bags. You buy a bag that they've put together in conjunction with the local food banks to find out what's needed. And very, very often, things like toothpaste and toothbrushes and things like that a family will be in desperate need of. If you are of the 30p Lennox school of thought, then you treat these families and these people with a nice mixture of contempt, derision and scepticism. What's that you say? You can't afford food? Get a better job. What's that you say? You can't afford shampoo? That's disgusting. You're pathetic. I don't believe you. The combination of hideousness and hilarity is off the charts because exactly the same people spit their dummies out when the Labour Party announces that it's going to put 20% VAT on school fees. working on the perfectly reasonable premise that private schools aren't charities and therefore should not have charitable exemption from VAT. It's mad that, right? Just that little point, that little comparison there. Find me someone that rages against poverty or denies poverty or pretends that poverty doesn't exist or just reserves a peculiar type of performative cruelty for people that are struggling. Remember the numbers we looked at yesterday? I'll probably get them the wrong way round. It's 9 million and 5 million who either have no savings or who have savings of less than £100. You've got no savings at all. You run out of money on the 28th and you're not getting paid until the 1st. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, if you're lucky, you might be able to use a food bank. But the narrative, the Murdoch-inspired narrative of hating vulnerable people, attacking poor people, is a thing to behold, because exactly the same people crack out the violins when the Labour Party announces that it's putting 20% on school fees. Oh my God, how will people cope? I don't care about people who can't feed their kids or can't afford soap or shampoo, but my God, the idea that somebody somewhere might struggle to meet the school fees that they're currently paying, this is the stuff of armed... This is just unbearable. How? Oh, my days, you can't afford the school fees. I can't express how sorry I feel for it. What's that? You can't feed your kids? Sod off. What's that? You say you can't afford your school fees? Oh, that's terror. I mean, imagine how boiled your brain would have to be to arrive at a place where you think people complaining about an increase in school fees deserve more sympathy than people complaining about the cost of living, rendering them unable to meet the basic needs and provisions of their families. And at this point, it is customary to remind you that 40% of people on universal credit are in work, if not more. So I'm afraid those lazy Murdoch-inspired tropes don't work either. So that's the politics of it, right? Also, I will be affected by this Labour policy, and it will mean that I am spending more money as a consequence of a Labour Party policy than I am currently, in much the same way that if Liz Truss's mini-budget had gone through, I'd have been quids in. I did the sums. That was a mistake. I did the sums on how I would personally have been affected by Liz Truss's budget. It would have been easier for her to come around my house with a wheelbarrow full of money and just go, "Hello, James, I've got some money for you." And then she'd empty the wheelbarrow in the front garden and I'd send the kids out with bin liners to pick it all up. That is what Liz Truss's mini budget would have done for me. And guess what? I still think it was an absolute debacle designed effectively to enrich the people least in need of help while further impoverishing the people most in need of help. And that wasn't an accident. That was the policy. So here I am looking at the Labour policy to put 20% VAT on school fees, conscious of the fact that I will be affected by it and conscious of the fact that I can afford it, which means that if I was of a conservative bent and you were telling me that you're worried you won't be able to afford it, I'd just laugh at you and tell you to get a better job. That's what I would do, right? If I was right-wing and I could afford something and you were right-wing, left-wing or no-wing and you couldn't afford something, I would tell you to get on your bike. Is that the right language? What's that you say? You can't afford your school fees? Get on your bike, I say. Or, well, if you can't afford to pay your children's school fees, you shouldn't have had children in the first place. Have I got this right? Is that how it works? Is that how it's very easy, isn't it? No wonder it's such a popular position for almost every newspaper columnist in the country. You can't afford school fees? Well, you shouldn't have had children in the first place, eh? Should you? What's that you say? You can't afford school fees? Well, you need to get a better job, don't you? You need to work harder. You need to work harder. I don't care. What's that you say? 23 hours a day? Well, I think you'll find there's 24 hours in the average day. You should be working all of them. You can't afford school fees. Get on your bike, get a better job, and don't have children in the first place. Is that how it works? Those are the three things you say, isn't it? I think I've heard this happen. If someone can't afford food, well, you need to get a better job. You need to get on your bike. Well, if you can't afford food, maybe you shouldn't have had children in the first place. But if you can't afford school fees, crikey, roll out the red carpet, crack open the violin, start the symphony of sympathy, because compassion starts here. That's absolutely insane. Think about it for a minute. Oh, I'm very worried about people who are going to have to pay higher school fees. Couldn't give a fig about people who can't afford their heating bills, who can't pay their food bills. Absolutely unbelievable. If you're just tuning into this programme, I am taking the mickey out of people who say things like, get on your bike, get a better job, and if you can't afford it, don't have children. All right. I don't know that phone-ins all used to sound like that. Thankfully, they generally don't anymore. But that's the story. Labour would introduce a 20% VAT charge on private school fees immediately if it wins the general election, which means even in the next academic year, the higher charges could kick in. And I've got the politics out of the way now, because you might not like what I say next. Private education is fundamentally unfair. That is why we pay. It is a choice that is taken by people lucky enough to be in a position to make that choice, that giving their children a head start in life, an unfair head start in life, it would be stupid not to do it. If the head start is available, you would be stupid not to take it. Some people manage to be bigger and even more moral than that. The ones I think of first are actually Alistair Campbell and his wife Fiona Miller, who could obviously afford to send their children to private school but elected not to, and I think in Fiona's case got heavily involved in the governance of the school with the hope of pulling everybody with them on the path to improvement. My dad would come back from the grave and haunt me if I could afford to send my children to private school and didn't. He was, a man who valued education, partly because he didn't have much, left school at 15, but crucially understood, having ended up on the Daily Telegraph, the secret codes of class in this country. And for good or for ill, he wanted me to have the golden ticket that he didn't have. And guess what? It worked. Right? Dad, infinitely better journalist than me. In terms of measurable career success, I've done better than him. And I shouldn't have done, because he's a much, much, much better journalist than I would ever be, but I speak the lingo, right? I've got the moves, what they call the public school swagger. I know the people. I'm the kind of person when I meet somebody new and they say, what school did you go to? You don't say, why are you asking me what school I went to? You never would have heard of it. You say, well, I went to blah, blah, blah. And they say, oh, you must know. Blah, blah, blah. And I say, oh, yes, of course I do. I have to say his brother. Still playing cricket, is he? Marvellous. And it comes very naturally to me. I'm not ashamed of it or embarrassed by it. I'm proud of the effort and the energy that my parents put into giving me this wonderful, wonderful gift. But it probably shouldn't exist. And then I give it to my children while acknowledging that it probably shouldn't exist. You're quite right. I missed a bit. If you can't afford your school fees, just cancel your Netflix subscription and stop eating so many avocados on toast. So there it is. It shouldn't exist, but as long as it does exist, I'm having it. I'm having it for me and I'm having it for my kids, right? But here's the thing. Here's the thing I genuinely don't understand. Or rather, I understand it, but I don't have a neat answer to it. Because if you've got an unfair privilege, right, an unfair advantage, and don't waste 10pence calling me, well, you can't afford it actually, can you? But if you could afford it, don't waste 10pence calling me to tell me how hard you work to send your children to private school, because that's deeply insulting to people who work at least as hard as you do, but couldn't dream of finding 10, 15, 40,000 pound a year to educate their children. So it's got nothing to do with how hard you work. There are questions about prioritisation. Some people would rather drive a fancy car and go on foreign holidays than privately educate their children, but you're both privileged. You're just choosing to exercise your financial privilege in different ways. So don't waste 10pence calling me about that. Here's the bit I don't get. Here's the bit I really don't get, and it's philosophy, this. So you've got an unfair advantage that is currently enjoyed by, let us say, for the sake of argument, 10% of the population. 10% of this, a bit lower than that actually, but in order to do the sums that I'm going to need to do while building up this question, I'm sticking with 10% because it's nice and easily divisible. So 10% of the population enjoys an unfair advantage. 10% of the nation's children enjoy an unfair advantage. What's better? Leaving it as it is or reducing it to 8% or 5%? You are not removing it. So the unfair advantage is still in place. Now, my dad absolutely of the view that if he can get me over that line, if he can get one of those golden tickets for his boy, then he's going to move heaven and earth to get it. And he is going to. I realised after he died and I went through his effects that he couldn't really afford it. Okay, breaks my heart that I cannot now turn around and, look after him a bit. Breaks my heart. Absolutely breaks my heart. He couldn't really afford it, but he did it. And I become one of the 10%. And I accrue and enjoy all the advantages that come with that. Not just the educational attainments. I'm the kind of kid who could quite easily have got lost in a comprehensive school because I was, as you could probably imagine, I was a prat as a teenager. And I revelled in not doing stuff. And I was lucky at my school to encounter amazing teachers who looked after me and saw through my foolishness and steered me until I got expelled, which is another illustration of me being a prat, just in case you thought I was exaggerating. And it didn't stop me. Even getting expelled from school in my final year didn't stop me from going to a brilliant university and enjoying a career that I thank the Lord every day for. Okay? None of it would have happened without the school that I went to, without the education that I got. I like to think it might have done. That's just arrogance. It wouldn't have done. Right? So that 10% includes me. And I think it is a good thing that I'm in it. And it's not just people like, I don't know, Zach Goldsmith and Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think it's a good thing that I got that golden ticket. I think the country is better off because a few people like me got that golden ticket rather than them just being handed down hereditarily. I don't think that's a word. I should get a refund on that term's fees. Rather than the golden tickets being handed down through a hereditary system to the children of the people who had golden tickets. My dad didn't have a golden ticket. He got one for me. He bought one for me. So what's better? If you're not getting rid of the golden ticket, what's better? 10% of the population having it and it therefore being accessible to people like us? Or 5% having it and it being accessible to nobody who hasn't got, let's just say, for the sake of argument, for a boarding school place, 50 grand, after tax, clear, per child. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm being desperately, brutally honest with you, because as with an awful lot of people who have a personal relationship with this issue, I don't know how much of my opinions are based upon my experiences and how much of them I would hold if I'd had very different experiences. And you could tell, because my voice broke, that when I think about what my dad did, it makes me cry. It makes my heart swell. And you will never change that. But neither will you ever change my view that these advantages shouldn't exist. They shouldn't be for sale. But if they are for sale, how can it be better for even fewer people than now to have access to them than yesterday? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It's 20 past 11. 23 minutes after 11 is the time. I don't know what the politics of it will be. I don't imagine that parents will be facing a 20% increase in their school fees. I think the school will absorb some of it. Some private schools, of course, are owned by investment vehicles. There's one in my neck of the woods that's been closed down with less than a term's notice for parents, presumably because the hedge fund or whatever you call it that owns it has decided they can make more money by building flats on the site. So, the politics of it. And all of the money that is raised by the increase on by charging VAT on school fees will go to the state education system. So it's win-win in one sense. But if an unfair advantage is available to 10% of the population, in the great scheme of things, is it better to leave it at 10 or to reduce it to, let's just say, 5 for the sake of argument? And I don't know the answer to that. Sarah is in High Wycombe. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
so I'm a teacher. I'd like to tell you how it would work in our area if there was a 5% reduction in children able to attend private school. We've got a very big problem in Buckinghamshire with private schools poaching staff members from state schools at a time of a recruitment crisis.
Right, yes.
So we've recently had our caretaker poached by the local private school.
Caretaker?
My head teacher, our caretaker's been poached by the local, headhunted.
Yes.
Our head teacher is now cleaning the school because we can't recruit. My daughter's school, the physics department, almost the whole physics department, secondary school, was poached by the local private school. So we've lost those teachers. We're a grammar school area.
Yeah.
And what happens with the children who don't get selected for the grammar school is that a large number of these energetic, well-meaning parents send their children off to the local private school. So the comprehensive/secondary modern is deprived of a lot of enthusiastic parents who really care about their children's education. So in my area, if there was a 5% reduction in the number of children in private schools, it would be good news all around. It would be good news for the recruitment crisis that is facing the school where I teach. It would be good news for the parent-teacher associations, for the local secondary modern comprehensives, because they would get an influx of new parents. So all-round good thing here.
So we are battling, I am battling, this texter says, with the choice of personal benefits versus community benefits. You can't really argue with that, can you? And that's what you've just crystallised. It would be better for the community to have fewer people enjoying that unfair advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And
what about the sense of hereditary privilege, though? What about the fact that the pyramid? It's almost like you'd be inserting a space where now the pyramid is solid. The chances of getting from the bottom 90% of it into the top, or the bottom 95% of it into the top 5%, is even smaller than it was before.
I think I've got a unique perspective on this because my husband works for an international company, and we're the sort of family that Liz Truss and now Kwarteng and now Rishi Sunak are trying to shower with money.
Yes.
So if they scrapped inheritance tax, we'd be cartwheeling all the way to the bank.
Right.
So I see that. But then I see what's happening in the school where I teach, where we have children who are sharing beds because they haven't got enough beds.
Yeah.
We've got families using food banks. We've got the system of special needs support collapsing. And I say, absolutely, bring it on with the tax on private school fees, because the needs of the community are much more important than the needs of these already wealthy families.
Okay, that's beautifully put, Sarah, and I thank you. I said that people would be unable to change my feelings on this issue, but I don't think I can necessarily say the same about my thoughts. 27 minutes after 11 is the time. Geordie's in Brussels. Geordie, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Very nice talking to you.
Thank you.
I think that the first element to introduce in this conversation, I think that is also applicable to many other conversations, is one of conservative circles. If you think about yourself or your family, obviously the rational decision is to take to a private school. That is obvious. But then if you think in national terms, that changes, because what you're seeing is the effect in the rest of the country and in society as a whole. Same thing can apply if we talk about energy or the environment. Now, moving on to the education system, I think that there is one example, if I'm not mistaken, where they took this to the extreme, and that is Finland. And what they did was to simply abolish private education. So they said everyone's going to be through public education. This means that the policies of the government are geared towards benefiting all families and not just a few. Because the problem that we have in systems like in the UK, be it the 10% or the 5%, is that these 5 or 10% have an oversized influence in the policies of the country. So you can imagine that Eton is not going to have a problem with leaky rooftops like some of the schools now going on. So by diminishing from 10% to 5% or even more, you would create an incentive for public officials to make policies that benefit the whole of the country.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. I think I'm on a hiding to nothing with this one. So it is as that texter said, it's the difference between the personal and the public. What's best for you as an individual, having access to private education will be an advantage that I can enjoy.
That is correct.
What's best for society? Reduce it as much as you can. So even having it at 5% is better than having it at 10%.
That is correct. And this is why these discussions are so insidious, because both sides are correct.
Yes.
But it depends from which conceptual circle you are judging the situation.
Beautifully put.
The more you take, or the wider view you take, the more you have to look after the country instead of after a particular set of individuals.
Yeah, it's very nicely put, and as ever with international comparisons, you do realise that we're a funny little place. Finland outperforms us on every educational metric with a well-funded state education system and very, very, very few private schools. I think there's only one in Sweden. I could be wrong about that, but I think it's mostly for the children of diplomats and the idea of having private schools is a little bit ridiculous. I don't agree with your premise, just for balance. If you simply say private school is an unfair advantage, it's a slippery slope. Next, you'll be saying that anyone who earns more than average has an unfair advantage, and we tax everyone to equity. Fact is, the state system won't cope with the influx of new students, and all pupils will be worse off with bigger class sizes, etc. All the money raised from the VAT will go into the state system. And I'll tell you now that when you get some sharp-elbowed middle-class parents who've just been squeezed out of being able to afford private school, turning up in their local state schools, everything will improve. I mean, it just will. You'll have more fundraising. You'll have better PTAs. You'll have... I don't like this. It's not an ideal scenario, but it is exactly what would happen. And it's not a slippery slope any more than having an NHS that's free at the point of care is a slippery slope. And of course, you pay more into that according to how much you earn. So, listen, everyone is going to come at this from a personal perspective. And that's why I think my own personal perspective upsets some people, because it's so honest. It's so brutally honest. It's grossly unfair. But if I can afford it, I'm having it. What I won't tolerate is people claiming that somehow people who can't afford to feed their children deserve contempt and scepticism, and people who are worried that they might not be able to afford increased school fees deserve sympathy and a warm hug. I'm making a list of all the things that you can say to them about getting on your bike, getting a better job, cancel your Netflix subscription, maybe have fewer tattoos, stop having avocado and toast for your tea. And of course, ultimately, if you can't afford school fees and you don't want your children to go into the state school system, then don't have children if you can't afford them. 11:32 is the time. Lottie Morley has your headlines. It is 11:36. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where in a way, it's politics distilled, isn't it? Are unfair advantages good or bad for society? The answer is they're bad for society, but they're good for the people who get them. So, inheritance tax is a weird one. We may talk about that next, but it's possibly too similar to this. I saw some research yesterday that showed even when it's made clear to people that they are never going to have to pay inheritance tax, they still have a particular problem with it as a levy. I don't know why. And then you hear people saying it's a tax on aspiration. It's nothing of the sort. I mean, logically, you'd much rather pay tax when you're dead than when you're alive. But of course, if you're a parent, you like the idea of passing on money to your children for very much the same reasons that you like the idea of paying to give your children a head start in life. And it's not just about the education, as I keep saying. I mean, that's why private education is an unhelpful phrase. Because, the difference between going to Eton in terms of the social cachet that it gives you, the doors that it opens, the handshakes that you learn, the old school tie, the power of the old school tie, the difference between going to Eton or even my old school, which is far from in its heyday these days, but it was when I was there, a place called Ampleforth, sort of like the Catholic equivalent, some people sometimes say, which isn't really true, but it has a cachet that you're not going to get by going to your local fee-paying day school. So there's all sorts of things that you're paying for, some of it measurable, some of it not. But of course it's unfair. And yet reducing access to it for more people also feels unfair. It's funny. 11:37 is the time. Francesca is in Barnet. Francesca, what would you like to say?
Good morning to you, James. I have to say that I find that the 20% increase on the school fees of the VAT is terrible. It's really difficult for middle class parents like myself who have good jobs but yes, perhaps not quite good enough to already afford them with the cost of living crisis, with the mortgage rates going up. It's basically pricing people who typically went to these schools out. And I went to one of these schools from the age of 5 all the way up to 18. My parents were working class, and they, managed to get the money together to send me and my sister to a private school. Fast forward all these years, I've managed to have a great education thanks to them, university and a very good career. And my husband and I would struggle to
But
send
this is the point where I say, with my tongue in cheek, I don't want to heck to you, but then this is the point where I say, as a right-wing radio presenter, that, well, sadly, your career's just not good enough, is it? So you're going to have to get a better job if you can't afford the school fees. Because I've heard people say that about parents who can't feed their children. So there's absolutely no problem saying it to people who are just worried they may not be able to afford private education. Have you thought about getting fewer tattoos, Francesca?
I don't have any tattoos.
Okay. What about cancelling the Netflix subscription?
Well, we've thought of everything. And I think, the thing that people would struggle to believe is that, I'm a solicitor in the city. I earn, a very good salary compared to some. It's unbelievable for some people to think that, it would be difficult for us. I mean, yes, we can do it, but it would just be increasingly difficult. An extra 20%, is actually a lot of money.
But you're not hearing anything that I'm saying. It is. I mean, if I just simply apply the rhetoric of not being able to afford things that most people would consider to be essentials, and the country that we live in, the ecosystem that we inhabit, those people are routinely told that it's their fault. They can't afford things. So the idea that I'm supposed to muster up reserves of sympathy for people worried that they may not be able to afford to continue to privately educate their children, you must see on one level how ridiculous that is.
I do see how ridiculous it is. I definitely take your point on board. But what I think you're missing is that, it's very different. You're talking about two very different things. Do I agree that we should tell people who can't
We're talking about an epic unfair privilege versus the most basic of essentials.
Yeah, you see, I disagree with you when you say that it's a privilege and that people get ahead in life. And the reason why I say that is because I look at the job that I'm in, and I look at some of my colleagues that I work with, and they haven't had the
93% of them.
Well, but
93% of them went to state school, did they?
I don't know the percentage. I'll be honest with you.
I do. But it's nowhere near 93%. Let's just look at high court judges. You're a lawyer, so you'll know what percentage of them went to state school. Is it just a coincidence, or the state or the private schools just somehow magically attract the most gifted future lawyers?
But I think that to go to a good private school where people are becoming high court judges who are extremely bright people.
No, they're no brighter than the people at your local comprehensive school.
But you have to take, but some of these, James, like some of these schools you have to take entrance exams to get in. So if you're not
and some of them you don't.
You can't go.
Yes,
exactly.
But there's people at the local state school who would get in. But their parents can't even dream of paying the fees. This is the bit of the conversation that I find most surreal. If it doesn't bestow an unfair advantage, why are you paying for it?
For all the other things that come with it, the amazing facilities that they have at these schools, the sports grounds that they've got, the music. If your child, let's say, isn't particularly academic, then
they might find something they can do in the future that's not based on academia. That's an unfair advantage to the kid over the road who's not particularly academic, who's not going to the school. Listen, I'm in the same boat as you, although I'm in exactly the same boat as you. But this determination to deny that it's unfair just fascinates me. Of course it's unfair.
But that's just the way the whole system is built, isn't it?
Yes, it's an unfair system. But why are you so keen to deny that it's an unfair advantage? Why do you need... Because I'm comfortable saying it's unfair.
Because I don't see it. I mean, in my line of work that I do, I don't see it as an unfair advantage. If I had it right in front of me, then I would say, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I don't agree with private schools. I don't understand
what you're saying now.
Why not?
If you had it right in front of you, you'd say it was unfair, but in your line of work, you don't think it is.
I don't think it's because not everybody around me also went to a private school.
But for it not to be, back to the numbers again, for it not to be an unfair advantage in your high-flying city job, you would need to have 93% of your colleagues state educated for it not to have bestowed an unfair advantage on the privately educated contingent.
But I think it's also a choice that every parent makes, isn't it?
It's not a choice that every parent makes. It's a choice that every parent who can afford it makes.
That's true. I take your point there. That is true. But why do you have to penalise us even more if we want to make that choice for our children?
Because it entrenches an unfairness at the heart of our society. And it's not. Why is it penalising you? It's a great privilege. If you have to pay more, it becomes an even more rarefied constituency that you're a member of.
I think it's important for a lot of people that to correct the assumption that a lot of children that go to these schools have, millionaire parents.
No one said that on this show. No one has even suggested that on this show. In fact, I spoke about my own father who couldn't afford it really, but somehow managed to cobble the cash together. So I'm afraid that cliche doesn't wash here either, Francesca.
They did this morning on Nick Ferrari's show.
I'm not responsible for what happens on Nick Ferrari's show.
But I'm just saying that I'm just making the point that not everybody, if some people think that an extra 20% isn't actually going to have a big effect on a lot of people.
Of course it is. Of course it is going to have a big effect. Otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. But it is. We're coming round in circles, and the biggest circle of all is your reluctant stroke refusal to admit that it's an unfair advantage, even as you pay significant sums of money to secure it for your children.
I just think it's a choice as opposed to an unfair advantage, but we can agree to disagree.
No, we can't, I'm afraid, because it isn't. That's a bit like saying that's an apple and you say it's a pear and then we agree to disagree. It's a bloody apple, Francesca. It's an unfair advantage. Otherwise, you simply wouldn't be paying for it. You are paying to give your children something that is denied to children, 90% of children in this country. You just are.
You give it to your children as well.
Absolutely, and I'm telling you it's an unfair advantage. Why have you got a problem admitting it?
But if you feel that way, though, why do you do it?
Because I don't want your children to have a monopoly on that advantage. I want mine to be in the game as well, just like my dad wanted me to be in the game. I'd rather the advantage didn't exist.
But you can't change that unless we live in a communist society.
Oh, really? So every country where there's no private education is a communist society, is it?
No, I don't mean it like that. Sorry.
How do you mean it then?
I just think that the other countries that have amazing state schools, which you're absolutely right to have pointed out earlier, I think that their whole taxation system and the way that they deal with things is very different.
No, it's not.
I don't agree with...
Finland just abolished it. Right. Finland just abolished it cold. Just took a decision one day, we're not going to have private schools anymore.
But I think unless the government actually takes a bigger decision...
Well, that's what the government is doing when it's a Labour government. It's introducing the 20%, which reduces the amount of people enjoying this massively unfair advantage. And the lower that number gets, the better society and the fairer society becomes.
And where are all the children that, come out of private school to go into state school? Where are they going to go when there are no places for them?
There are loads of places. Schools in central London are closing. Primary schools have got a huge shortage of new children starting, to the point that many schools are closing. And you won't find anyone in the United Kingdom that can't find a place in a school for their child. So you don't need to worry on their account.
I do think that there are lots, especially in the area that I am. I'm speaking of secondary schools that genuinely don't have extra places, and children don't have places to go.
Okay, well, if we end up in a mythical future where children are roaming the streets unable to attend school, then that would be the responsibility of government. But it's not an argument for continuing the perpetuation of a hugely unfair advantage that we secure for our children by dint of being wealthy. In fact, if you want a fair society, it should be the children of the poorest parents that go to the very, very best schools, and then the future would become more equal for everybody. I'm not sure I can help you any more than I have already, but I'll tell you one thing for nothing. It's an apple. It is 10 minutes to 12. I guess it's a question of deserving, isn't it? You kind of have to kid yourself that you deserve something. It's about being born 3-0 up and thinking you've scored a hat-trick, or being born on third base for our American listeners, and indeed viewers on YouTube. You're born on third base and you think you've scored a triple. I don't get that. I don't see why, if you're enjoying an unfair advantage, you people struggle to admit that it's an unfair advantage. But it is all tied up in the British class system. Do you think Jacob Rees-Mogg ever looks at himself in the mirror and thinks, flip it, heck, imagine if I'd gone to a bog standard comprehensive school, what the hell would I be doing now? Of course he doesn't. He thinks he's born to it. It's why a lot of them trumpet their Christian credentials, in quotes, because they believe that God made them high and lowly, the poor man at his gate, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. But it is, it's bizarre. But listen, I still, I don't even know if it counts as hypocrisy. It's just a simple admission of unfairness. And as long as this unfairness is for sale, I will be buying it for my children. Thank you very much. 11:51 is the time. Imisalua is in Fulham. Where are you on this one?
Morning, James.
Hello.
We've had this conversation before. I went to a private school.
And you went on a scholarship. I've been doing this job so long, I can tell the listeners that you went to private school on a scholarship, Imisalua. It's incredible, isn't it?
I know. It tells you how long I've been calling.
Well, you were still at school when you first started calling me.
Oh, was I?
Yeah, you were in the sixth form.
Oh, my gosh. If I tell you when I left sixth form, you're going to feel like I left in 2011.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Oh, my God.
Tell me about it. How do you think I feel? You feel old. Flipping heck. Anyway, where were we?
So I went to private school. Obviously, my mum for 11 plus made sure that I was so good at 11 plus exams like a scholarship was essentially what we wanted, because that's the kind of education that she wanted for me. Now, we didn't pay for it, but my mother wouldn't have put that much effort into making sure I had it if she didn't think there was an advantage to be gained from having it. So there's that. So I think even if you don't pay for it, if there are people who drill their children into making sure they get it because they recognise those advantages. That's number one. Number two, the lady that was the city solicitor that was speaking, it's really interesting because when you go to a school like mine, you are essentially taught that in order to send your children to a school like that, there are things you have to do. You need to get the grade. You need to go to this university. You need to go to that job. Right. So if you do all those things, if you follow the rule book, and you get to the point where you're supposed to enjoy the thing that you were working all this time for, and you can't have it, you're going to think that something has been done. Yes. You're going to think that you're being
penalised. If you, what is it that they say? If you've been privileged for your whole life, equality feels like oppression.
Exactly, and that's the interesting thing,
isn't it?
That's the interesting thing. People are willing to protect this thing because, the reality is, if you are a city solicitor, and I guess I don't know, I'm not assuming, but if you also had if your partner also had a good job, the reality is you should kind of be able to afford fees. Yeah. But fees are expensive. Like the school I went to was significantly cheaper then. It's almost 30 now. That's for one child. If you have two, that's 60k
it's off
after
the charts.
tax.
This is after tax. So there's a generational presumption that you'll be able to repeat what your parents did for you, but actually, we should see it in the same light as property ownership. We're living through a period now where, for the first time in living memory, people are less likely to own property than their parents were, and private education is going through a similar process. I guess
it is, but also like if you go to these schools
without the 20% increase.
Pardon?
It's already going up without the 20% increase.
Exactly. Private school fees are going up, and also financial assistance is less readily available.
Yes, that's
so
true.
Whereas most schools previously had like a package, so even if you weren't, I don't know, completely low income, if you were mid income, there was a bit of money for you that you could find. A lot of that isn't available now. You're gonna find that it's unfair. Also, the reality is, if you go to these schools, a lot of your friends go to these schools, a lot of your peers go to these schools. If you work where a lot of people go, everybody you know has gone to these schools.
But we divide the population into two types of people: people who ask new acquaintances where they went to school, and people who think that's an absolutely ridiculous question.
Yes, but you're also going to feel a bit put out and a bit weird if, you're, I don't know, having a conversation at coffee and you'll say, oh yeah, we signed our child up for this one, you signed our child up for that one. Yeah. And then you actually sit down and you think, oh wow, I actually can't. Yet I'm sitting here with all these people and I've been told that if I do all these things, I can go to this place and I can send my children, and then you can't do it.
No, you're right. And that's why there's a sense of a rug being tugged from beneath the feet. I'm not sure anybody is on what the numbers will actually be, the number of people for whom this becomes an insurmountable obstacle. I mean, we know people who found during lockdown that they could no longer afford school fees, and so the line is thin for some people. But can I make a speculation? Would you mind? Can I say that, like me, if you are in a position to buy this unfair advantage for your children when you have them, if you have them, then you will buy it?
Oh, I'm buying it. Yeah, that was never a question. I'm buying it.
Why? Just tell us why, if you don't mind.
Because I've benefited from it in insane ways. The education was one thing, but it was what I learnt outside of the education. Yeah. That was another. I'm a black woman. I was never necessarily uncomfortable in white spaces because I'd been in them since I was 11.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just white spaces; it was elite white spaces, and I was fine. Went through uni, fine. Worked, fine, because I've been doing it for so long.
Yes, of
you
course.
Learn how to navigate. You learn how to package yourself. You learn how to speak. You learn how to act around certain people. So it just becomes second nature. So when you get into spaces, you're fine.
So, and why would you not want that for your children? You'd be absolutely mad not to want it for your children, even as you acknowledge, both implicitly and explicitly, just as I do, that it is an advantage that should not exist. Imisalua, thank you. Making me feel ancient now. I shouldn't have gone down that little route of when she first started ringing into the programme. 11:57 is the time. Janice is in Cottingham. Janice, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello,
my personal view is that we should abolish private education altogether. Mm-hmm. And if we did that, the very privileged who run the country, who suddenly their children don't have this edge over everybody else. Can you imagine the change and the investment that would go into education in general?
No, it's a brilliant point. And there would still be, people would still be able to hire private tutors, and you'd still have social cachet, but it would just break down these rigid divisions in our society. The less rigid they are, the better for everybody, except the people on the top of it, except the people benefiting from it.
Absolutely. And, I heard the caller earlier about the schools having the best teachers poached.
Yeah.
Of course, that wouldn't happen either. Obviously schools are going to compete, but if the investment in schools were per capita equal, they're not even where I live. Some areas get more investment per capita, child capita, than others.
Yes.
But if it was all equal and there was a standard for every school to meet, I'm just saying, can you imagine the investment that there would be in our education system, in our school buildings, if those very few people at the top that with very, very deep pockets...
Everybody went to the same school. It's John Rawls's veil of ignorance, isn't it? What would the education system look like if you had no idea where your children were going to go to school? So if you took the entire Tory front bench, blindfolded them, and said to them, right, can you just now tell us what you want the education system to look like? And they'd say, well, how rich am I? And you say, sorry, we're not telling you that. You have to create a system on the presumption that you could be one of the poorest members of society or one of the richest members of society. What would you like that education system to look like? It wouldn't look much like the one we've got.
No, and wow, what a great point. Maybe we should put that to Parliament.
Right, John Rawls got a lot of answers to a lot of questions, actually, and probably certainly my favourite modern philosopher. Thank you, Janice. And a lot, it's a fascinating conversation. I'm glad that you found it as fascinating as I do, because obviously it's part of my identity. It's tied up in my love for my parents and my sense of my own role in society, success, if you'd allow me that word, and yet I don't really struggle at all to see it as an unfair advantage, possibly because it was drilled into me how lucky I was to be going there, how different. And, growing up in Kidderminster, it was abnormal among certainly the people we lived alongside to go to a school like that, so I got no problem seeing it as unfair. But I tried to be nice to people still struggling with that concept. 3 minutes after 12 is the time, so I didn't imagine it. I thought I might have done. Stephen Fry says his agents went ballistic after discovering that an AI-generated version of his voice was being used to narrate a history documentary. Partly, I think, because the audiobooks, the Harry Potter audiobooks that he recorded, would have created a database from which almost anything would be derived. He said, I said not one word of that. This is at a conference, an AI conference a couple of weeks ago. I said not one word of that. It was a machine. Yes, it shocked me. They used my reading of the 7 volumes of the Harry Potter books, and from that data set, an AI of my voice was created, and it made that new narration. It could have read me anything from a call. It could have me read anything from a call to storm Parliament to hard porn, all without my knowledge and without my permission. And this, what you just heard, was done without my knowledge. So that is part of the story. We're doing one of our regular AI conversations in which people who know a lot more than average about this issue share with those of us who don't know more than average what the state of play currently is. Can I share that thing you just told me, or is that it's not classified? So I'm going to be available on AI speaking foreign languages soon. So you'll be able to watch the show, and my mouth will move, and the words that come out of my mouth in my own voice will be Spanish or Turkish, or just think of a language, and I'll be speaking it soon. And that means that you could stumble across that online and think, crikey, he speaks my native language brilliantly. I thought he just had sort of schoolboy French and a little bit of holiday Greek. And you'd be right. So that's just a small personal discovery that I made in the last 3 minutes. And then I turned to the Daily Telegraph today, where the technology editor has a story about Rishi Sunak believing there is a small window to address safety concerns before the powerful next generation of AI technology is released. Whitehall sources have briefed the Telegraph on his fear that there may only be a year to prevent it running out of control. And he is worried about it being exploited by bioterrorists. I'm going to ask you shortly what we should and should not be frightened of. The Department for Science, Innovation and Technology gave a statement to The Telegraph saying, "We're at a crossroads in human history, and to turn the other way would be a monumental missed opportunity for mankind." And this summit that's being called is going to look at the AI capabilities in biological or cyber attacks, loss of control risks that could emerge from advanced systems. I want to know more about this, and I've told you already I'm giving up on being the bloke who who professes pride in his own ignorance. I'll still do that on some subjects, like TikTok. No, I can't do that. I'm quite big on TikTok now. I profess pride in being ignorant about some things, but it's not very helpful to profess pride in being ignorant about this. Like the person in the office who has to get someone else to show him how to use the printer. I don't want to be that person. I don't want to sort of embrace old age in that sort of slippers and pipe fashion. I want to understand AI better. And thanks to you, I always end these conversations doing so. So another element of this story involves Satnam Sanghera, the author and Times journalist. His book Empire Land is one of the finest things I've read in the last 10 or 20 years. And it turns out that there is an AI angle to this conversation as well, because lots and lots of writers are seeing their books being, I don't even know what the correct word would be. It's like absorbed by the database. And therefore you could, write something in the style of a famous writer. And it's stolen that writer's work in order to create the database from which an entirely new piece of work will spring, but it's work built with bricks that already existed, i.e. the writer's oeuvre, the writer's canon, the writer's previous work. Corpsey's already had a look at it and found one of my books on there as well, which means that I'm kind of having my efforts robbed a bit as a consequence of the rise of AI. And then Naomi Klein, the author, the brilliant author, you'll know her from No Logo and her books about disaster capitalism and environmental catastrophe. Her new book, Doppelganger, is an absolutely incredible piece of work. I was with her yesterday. She's this week's guest on Full Disclosure. But, the story's mad. So I don't know if you're familiar with Naomi Wolf, who wrote a book called The Beauty Myth and was very progressive and liberal and then went absolutely crackers. Shortly before COVID, she published a book that contained an epic error that was pointed out to her live on the radio. It's one of the most extraordinary moments of live radio you will ever hear. I've got a book coming out. I think I may have mentioned it. So the culmination of my book is the mini budget. It's Liz Truss's mini budget, Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget, and what it did to the financial markets, what it did to the economy. It would be, imagine if I were on a live radio show and the presenter said to me something like, no, it didn't cost the economy £35 billion. It made the economy, it was a £35 billion profit that happened immediately after Liz Truss's mini budget. And I've just written 100,000 words building up to the moment that this bomb went off, and I discover live on the radio that it was never a bomb at all. So she wrote a book about people being executed for homosexuality, which is kind of pertinent to what Suella Braverman's talking about in America later today. But she'd misunderstood the phrase death recorded. So she thought that all of this 19th century documentation she found that contained the phrase death recorded meant that man had been executed, whereas in fact it meant the opposite. It meant he hadn't been executed. And a journalist and an old friend of mine, I've known him since I was 16, would you believe, called Matthew Sweet, told her this live on the radio. And it all began to unravel, and she's ended up as a full-on anti-vaxxer, and she often pops up on GBBs and sundry other weird outlets. And people get her mixed up with Naomi Klein, who wrote No Logo, and The Beauty Myth and No Logo they spoke to similar spaces back in the day, going back 30 years, give or take a little. And so she found herself, Naomi Klein, online being mistaken for a conspiracy theorist. And she's written the most extraordinary book, a large part of which looks at conspiracy theories and looks at how the space created by lies about COVID isn't going away. New things are moving into it. The crossover with the wellness, the so-called wellness industry, with the anti-vax movement. The fundamental hypocrisy of people simultaneously contending that, for example, COVID was conjured up in a laboratory with the explicit intention of infecting a population with eavesdropping technology contained within vaccines or whatever else, but at the same time also claiming that it's all a big hoax and it's no big deal really and no one needs to worry about it, so you shouldn't wear a mask. So the absolute madness in that space. And she said to me yesterday that the world of conspiracy theories are already out of control, but with AI, with developments in artificial intelligence, God knows what could happen. And I wasn't quite sure what she meant, so I was thinking about it on the bus home, and I realised what she meant. And it's linked to the fact that you'll soon be able to see me broadcasting in Iranian. It's what you could create. So you could actually create Bill Gates looking down the barrel of a camera, telling you that the vaccines contain tiny microphones designed to track all your conversations and all your movements. And it would actually be, Bill, to all intents and purposes, it would be George Soros looking down the barrel of a camera, not a microphone, looking down the barrel of a camera, telling you that he is, well, whatever anti-Semitic conspiracy theory you want to subscribe to, you can get George Soros to confirm that he's the head of it on camera. And the skills that you're going to need to know the difference and the skills that broadcasters are going to need to tell the difference are astonishing. So there's 3 or 4 little examples there. You've got Stephen Fry narrating a documentary that he has absolutely nothing to do with, but if you happen to stumble across it on television, you would not have the first notion that it wasn't him doing it. You've got me presenting this program in a multiplicity of foreign languages, coming soon to a screen near you. You've got Naomi Klein, who has spent the best part of a decade looking deeply into all of these issues, expressing profound fear about what could be on the horizon, what is on the horizon with regard to AI and bad actors in the conspiracy theory space. And there are a lot of bad actors in the conspiracy theory space, not just the lad from Lewis who wasn't Lewis. But you've also now got Rishi Sunak warning about it in the context of terrorism and biological or cyber attacks. And I don't know how scared I should be. And I don't apologise for asking you that question. It's actually a really important question. And we've already discovered people listening to this programme who were very early adopters of AI, people who got into it very early on. And the innocuous end of it, I always remember the fella who got AI to rewrite his copy for his gym advert. Do you remember him? He was opening a gym and he wrote his own adverts, or he hired a professional copywriter. Then he got AI to do it, and the number of inquiries went up by 50% or 25%, a significant figure. Just somehow the AI pushed the buttons of the people viewing his Facebook page in a way that the words he'd written himself had failed to do. And I find that perfectly believable, because, you know, you're reaching the point now where anything a human can do, a computer can do better. So how worried should we be? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. The fundamental question is probably about danger. It is about this phrase, a crossroads in human history. What should we be worried about? What do you know that probably the rest of us don't know? But the next wave of AI could be much, much more powerful than today's technology, such as ChatGPT, and the next 12 months are crucial to getting ahead of the problem. So what does getting ahead of the problem look like? I wouldn't even know where to begin. But a lot of the responsibility is presumably going to lie with the platforms. You know, the platforms that put the stuff up are going to have to be a lot more responsible with regards to their publishing arm. They can't just say we're a marketplace. We're a forum where people can do what they want and post what they want. Of course, since Elon Musk bought Twitter, that their role as a safeguarder of the public good has been completely abandoned. He's set fire to that, actively encouraging idiots and conspiracy theorists to come onto the platform when previously those sort of activities would get them removed. YouTube is going to have a responsibility. But what would the responsibility be? So if it's me speaking Serbo-Croat, that's fine. But if it's me reading out the ingredients for a bomb, that's not fine. But they're both lies. I can't speak Serbo-Croat, and I didn't record the ingredients. So, whoa, what? Where do we get off? Where do we get on? How do we get ahead of it? You may have gathered from that introduction, which is coming in more or less on time, you may have gathered that you can ring in with almost anything this hour. I just want you to tell me stuff. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And the question is this: what should we be aware of with regard to AI technology, stampeding AI technology, and how worried, well, first of all, how worried are you? 0345 6060 973. And from that, of course, how worried should we be? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And I also have to acknowledge the people who know even less, the people who know nothing about this. So try this on for size, okay? Just listen to this. And so what I think, the Conservative Party, right, is like a bunch of drunk sailors in a lifeboat, isn't it? They're all shouting and arguing, but none of them are actually doing anything to keep the boat afloat. And in the meantime, the people in the country, the people of this country, are actually drowning. That's quite a good line, right? It's very me. This quote is in the style of James O'Brien. It's been constructed by AI in the last couple of minutes because it is both critical and humorous. He compares the Conservative Party to drunk sailors in a lifeboat, which is a metaphor for the way in which they are leading the country. He suggests that they're all fighting amongst themselves and not actually doing anything to help the people of the United Kingdom. So I love the idea that AI believes me to be both political and amusing and critical of speaking truth to power in an amusing way. I'll take that as a win. But, you know, what do you need me for? So I get that bit of it, and I'm interested in how the technology is advancing, but I also need some help in what the bio-terror threat, what the biological or cyber attacks would look like. What is it that AI is going to do in the arena of loss of control risks that could emerge from advanced systems? I just need you to explain this to me. And I'm not going to ask how confident you are. I mean, imagine if Nadine Dorries was still Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. I think this falls under science, innovation and technology, but it's probably a blurred line. A couple of phone lines free on this, so fill your boots. And if you're not in the business of ringing radio stations, but this is bang on your field, then break the habit of a lifetime and give me a call. 0345 6060 973. Neil's in Newbury. Neil, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I come at it from a photographic angle,
yes.
In that as a photographer and a podcaster as well, we ran a feature recently inviting listeners to try and identify if the pictures that one of the other listeners had shared was fake or real.
Yeah.
They were all fake. And I think the most concerning thing was that a lot of the photographers couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, so that's game over for photography as a profession then.
Well, in some genres, I think more than others. I think certainly in food photography, I think that's a very worrying genre for many photographers who are seeing, you don't have to spend hours laying out a perfect burger anymore. You can put in a picture from your iPhone and then create a picture using AI from it. And that worries food photographers. And I would imagine portrait photographers as well.
I mean, so this is personal to you, and I understand your worry. It's not an existential threat to civilization as we know it.
No, not at all.
and also, if I was your client, kind of probably good news rather than bad news, because it's going to save me your fee.
Yes, it is. Yeah, but how far does that ball roll down the road?
Well, exactly. It's all fun and games until someone starts presenting radio shows using AI.
Well,
and then everyone should sit up. Away. Everyone should sit up and take notice at that point, Neil. That's when things get serious.
Yeah.
I hear it. And so, I mean, how close do you think you are to game over on the food photography side of things?
I'm not a food photographer, but
no, I'm in the industry.
Two food photographers. There's a lot of conversation around,
and that will just be the beginning.
This being the start of the end.
That'll go next, and you've got. I mean, start with food, but eventually landscapes. You could just program almost anything, and that I think I do file under video killed the radio star. That's the idea that technology is so amazing, it's going to change everything. But actually, 10 years after it's introduced, we've adapted to the new normal. The side of it that I'm particularly interested is the idea of it now running at a breakneck speed, running out of control in the next year to a degree where it will post a a genuine threat to populations in the context specifically of biological and or cyber attacks. And if anyone can explain that to us, then I'll give you the Prime Minister's number. Dario Amodi, who's the chief executive of an AI lab called Anthropic, recently warned that the technology could allow many more actors to carry out large-scale biological attacks. He described that as a medium-term risk. If you can explain that to us, I'd be very grateful. Mike's in Marlow. Mike, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
We have a board game. I've got a copy of your board game, actually, which I won off you, but that's beside the point. It's called It's all about etymology, so finding words and meanings. For me to compile a set of questions would probably take me a week.
Yes.
If I did it with AI, an hour.
Gosh.
No, really.
No, I believe you. I completely believe you. I said, gosh, it wasn't an expression of scepticism, and it's all there.
Right. It's there, yeah. Absolutely. And all you've got to do then is edit it and make sure it's okay. Just make sure it's good enough to use. But it's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
Well, yeah, I mean, but again, this isn't frightening. This is just technology doing things that, how long did it used to take to, I don't know, copy a book? Before photocopiers existed, you had to do it all by hand. So so there's that side of it that is, as you say, it sounds ridiculous, but it's not spooky. What's spooky is you ringing me up next week and telling me about how things are going in Marlow, and you not actually having anything to do with that call at all. But it sounds like you, it walks like you, quacks like you, but it's not you.
Well, you see, the thing is, it's the same. It's the same result. It's we're looking at words, meanings, finding full descriptions of a word, and this just does it so quick. I don't even have to think about it really.
Yeah.
So has that taken the skill out of compiling a board game? I don't know.
All right. Well, no, you still need to come up with a concept, but I could presume it's a matter of time if it's not already there, when you could just put in the details of every board game that's ever been invented and AI will come up with a new one. Or you put in all the board games that are word-based and AI would come up with a new one. We were playing Bananagrams the other day. I'd not played that before, but all you would need to invent Bananagrams is a Scrabble kit. And yet it was a game we'd never encountered. Anyone with a Scrabble kit could have come up with it, and yet it was a person that did it. Next it will be a computer. I don't know. We may be jumping early on the bio-terrorism threat. The phone lines are full, but I don't know if anyone is qualified to comment on that, so I'll rattle through and then free up some more. Thank you, Mike. Richard's in Boncath in Pembrokeshire. Richard, what would you like to say?
Well, last evening I was watching some YouTube stuff and
I'm on there now,
yeah, I know.
Whole show,
I do.
mate. Whole show.
It's one of the reasons I started listening to you, because it suggested you to me. But I follow a lot of American politics on YouTube.
Yes.
And YouTube suggested to me, and I was looking for Donald Trump having a conversation with Carrie Lake, the failed Arizona governor.
Yeah. Who another conspiracy theorist on the 2019 election, isn't she? Or the 2020?
Yes. Yes. But they're both. It was AI generated, but it was 95% convincing. I mean, you could see it wasn't. But the thing is, it's only going to get better, isn't it? In 6 months' time, you'll see the same kind of video.
So they hadn't recorded anything together?
No. It was completely AI.
What were they talking about?
They were talking about basically. It was a spoof, making themselves look stupid, talking about stealing elections, and it was just it was obviously done by someone who's very, very anti-Trump.
Yeah.
But
But it was very, very plausible, and give it a year, and it will be even more plausible to the point of being indistinguishable from reality.
Exactly. That's what I think. Anyway, it seemed. Like I say, and it wasn't just one, because then there was another one. I can't believe that YouTube are allowing them to go.
No,
because it probably won't appear. But the thing is, it was so obvious. Some Republican would see it and report it to YouTube, but what happens if it gets to the stage where they make it a lot subtler, that, and it's Joe Biden, and he's saying stuff about, anti-Republican stuff. And
you just have to have impersonation policies in place, like Twitter used to have before Elon Musk came along and set fire to everything. You would have to contact YouTube and say, there's a video up purporting to be me, and it's not me. But, I mean, crikey, how far around the world would it have gone before the truth gets its trousers on?
Well, exactly.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it is creeping up. So I don't know what you do. Normally, I reach for video killed the radio star when we're having conversations like this. Video games, technology, whatever it is. It's there were plenty of people who thought that we should be worrying more about blacksmiths when Henry Ford popularised the motor car, and the world turns and we accommodate it and we get used to the new normal. But this feels different. This feels like a different form of threat, doesn't it? A different form of future.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it is. It is.
We shall see. And someone by 1 o'clock might know a little bit more about the biological and cyber risks that Rishi Sunak is reportedly worrying about. Thank you, Richard. Mind how you go. It is coming up to 12:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A lot of you excited about that conversation I had with Naomi Klein yesterday. It will be available on Friday. Although this week's full disclosure is really good. Actually, Gabby Logan, who. You talk about change and the new normal becoming accommodated really quickly. But the notion of female sports broadcasters is so common now. It's so normal now. My girls watch the World Cup and it doesn't cross their mind that it's A, remarkable to see women's football on primetime terrestrial television, and B, it's remarkable to see a studio full of women pundits and players commenting on the game. 10 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Men were still having kittens about the idea of a woman running the line in a football match 10 years ago. And it struck me, actually, after talking to you about something to do with the football, that Gabby Logan is a wonderful pioneer who probably doesn't get the credit she deserves for banging down some of the doors that needed to be banged down. And it's a lovely, lovely conversation. I really liked her. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 12:34 is the time. It knows me quite well, actually. But then again, I talk every day for hours. So there's going to be a hell of a lot of source material there if you want to build up an image of me in a data set and in a computer. So this is quite funny. I wouldn't have occurred to me to do this because, well, you know why. This is me on motoring matters, Keith. Imagine we're doing a show on motoring matters, which we will never do. But this is nice. There's one mistake in it. In the very first line, I wonder if you can spot it. Motoring matters, my friends. Buckle up because we're diving into the world of cars, traffic and all things automotive. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to motoring, I've got a few thoughts to share. So it's time to put on our thinking caps and dissect this fascinating subject. Let's start with the state of our roads, shall we? It's a daily frustration for many of us. The potholes, my goodness, the potholes. They're like landmines out there waiting to destroy our tyres, our suspension and our patience. And don't even get me started on the seemingly never-ending roadworks. Got us all crawling along at a snail's pace. It's as if the whole world decided to undergo construction simultaneously. That's AI. It's me speaking. Don't get too confused, but the words were constructed by or put together by AI. Thank you to Tristan for sending that in. And the idea, of course, is that it would have access to a lot of me and therefore would know how I would sound when you give it a subject to run with. Do you know what the obvious mistake was? I'd never, ever would say my friends because I'm only ever talking to you. I'm never talking to like 1.4 million people. I'm only ever talking to you when I'm on the radio. Just you, just those ears right there. So I'd never say my friends or folks or ladies and gentlemen or something like that. It's just the way I prefer to think of my time in the morning. But apart from that, it was pretty good. 12:36 is the time. Guy's in Stafford to almost certainly make a slightly more serious point than I just managed. Guy, what would you like to say?
Oh, well, first of all, long-time listener, first-time caller.
Welcome. Thank you.
Very, very, very nervous, but we'll go with it.
It's only me. Take your time.
So, with regards to the kind of biosecurity aspect of AI, I do think that there are kind of some concerns that we should have. I think it is going to be absolutely brilliant for medicine. We're seeing it kind of used to look at images, to detect cancer, and it can do that to a remarkable kind of accuracy.
Really?
So yeah, you basically feed in lots of images of kind of cancers, and it can learn that's what a cancer looks like. That's just an abnormality.
Got it.
And it can do that really, really well and really quickly.
Gosh.
There was a study done in America this year where they were looking at specific antibiotics, because we know antibiotics are becoming less and less useful.
Yes.
And within an hour and a half, an AI model was able to analyse nearly 7,000 compounds.
Wow.
And kind of figure out which ones would work, which ones wouldn't work, was able to kind of tweak the designs of the different compounds to make them better.
What would, I mean, in ballpark terms, you may not know this, but what would that have been in man hours?
Years, I would say.
Years. Okay.
If you got to think about designing a new molecule, making a new molecule, testing a new molecule, it's able to do the brunt of that work in an hour or an hour and a half. In terms of the negatives for it, if you were to design a model to say make a chemical that can kill someone,
it's the corollary of what you just described, isn't it? Find me the most deadly poison ever.
Yeah, and if you can design it, you can make it very easily, and then
so that's where the bioterror threat comes from.
Yeah, and is a hospital going to have the facilities to find out what it is? If it's brand new, then they might not know how to treat it. They might not know what kind of treatments are best for it.
But you can't get ahead of that, can you? I don't see how governments could get ahead of that unless they're controlling the access to the technology, which they simply won't be able to do. Yeah,
exactly. And I think you've got the brilliance of it, but in the wrong hands, it could be disastrous.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, so you've identified the problem, but you haven't given as much comfort that there is a way of addressing it. Or I keep using this phrase because I read it in the coverage this morning: getting ahead of the problem. I don't see what that would look like. So this is what Michelle Donnellan said, the Science and Technology Secretary. We need almost like a smoke alarm established, so that not only are companies searching for, but have a response to the risk, and we know at what level they respond and how they respond. That doesn't fill me with confidence, Guy.
No, and I think there's a lot of vested interests that are going to mean that restrictions and legislation is going to be nigh and impossible. I think there's too many big companies that could make millions and billions out of use of AI in medicine that you're just not going to get the strong enough legislation to stop the bad people doing bad things.
No. Well, I mean, and if you did, it would have to be a level of international cooperation that this country in particular seems to be walking away from on various other fronts, whether it's on refugees or trade. The idea that we're better on our own. It couldn't be more ridiculous in the context of this. Actually, thank you, Guy. It's worth mentioning, given that Suella Braverman has successfully secured headlines with her latest bile about refugees. It's even by her standards, this is really, really stupid. So the idea, because the only way her current policies work is if we pretend that we are facing unique problems. So the idea that why are people coming here from France? France is a safe country is both stupid and dangerous logic, but it's quite attractive to the kind of people that fell for Brexit. But, I mean, how do you get to France? So where would every refugee have to stop if Suella Braverman's ideas were adopted by every country? They'd all be stopping at the Syrian border. Countries like Saudi Arabia already take far, far, far more refugees from other Middle Eastern countries than we ever will. But the whole logic, if you want to use that word, and frankly I don't really, but it's the nearest thing you can use to describe someone who dreams of planes full of genuine asylum seekers being flown to Rwanda for the rest of their life, appearing on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. It only works if no one else is doing the same thing. If everybody adopted the idea that Suella Braverman is adopting, there'd be absolute carnage. Absolute carnage. The only way you cope with a refugee crisis is through international cooperation, putting pressure on the countries doing less than average to do more, and therefore allowing the countries doing more than average to have the freedom to do less, which, of course, if they're well run with an honest media, they wouldn't feel any particular need to do. So, I mean, the level of stupidity it takes to sort of say out loud what Suella Braverman is slated to say later today in America is truly breathtaking. Truly breathtaking. But if your brain's been boiled by bile regarding refugees, this is what happens. I mean, the point for me with her of no return would be when an actual Holocaust survivor stood up in her own constituency meeting and said, could you stop using this language? It's really reminiscent of how people spoke about my family in 1930s Germany. And Suella Braverman effectively told her to shut up and go away, to paraphrase Gavin Williamson. She sort of refused to take on board the criticism at all. So the reason why it's politically weird is that she can't yet say, we don't want anybody coming here ever. If she did, she'd hoover up the UKIP vote, but nobody else, and she'd alienate an awful lot of decent Tories who do exist. So she can't say that out loud, but she has to keep talking. So it's just this constant dance between the unspeakable and the unsayable, and that's where she is. That's why she is where she is today. Farage said to the far right in Germany once, when he went out there to give a speech at the invitation of the granddaughter of a very senior Nazi, Farage actually said that you've got to start saying the unspeakable out loud. It was when he was sort of a little bit high on his own supply, politically speaking. He actually said it, but of course the British media ignored it. But that is part of the same problem that Braverman has at the moment. What she wants to say is nobody should ever come here from anywhere. We shouldn't be taking in any vulnerable people at all. But she can't. So she has to keep making these weird castles in the air that she's unveiling today. It'd be nice if the media had caught up with the fact that this is morally completely corrupt and devoid of any intellectual substance, but they can't because she's the Home Secretary. They have to report what she does and what she says because that's the model of the media, in the same way that the American media has to report what Donald Trump says and does because he is or was a president and is a former president. The idea that you can ignore people because they're idiots is cancelled out by the status of the job that they've inhabited, even if they're talking complete bilge. And if you want to see what happens when senior political journalists completely abnegate their responsibility to tell their viewers and their listeners that politicians are talking bilge, there's a documentary series unfolding on the BBC at the moment where their political editor somehow manages to detail chaos that she was covering at the time without ever mentioning to the watching public that it was chaos. So you spend 3 years tickling Boris Johnson's toes and then make a documentary series about how awful it all was when he was in charge. Absolutely extraordinary. That wasn't me, by the way. That was AI. 12:49. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the conversation about AI is as illuminating as always, but it's different from a lot of the conversations that we have together because it is... Well, it's a developing reality, isn't it? And that means that no one can speak with certainty. No one can go definitive, to coin a mystery hour phrase. But I always find it very, very illuminating. 12:49 is the time. Lawrence is in Hastings. Lawrence, what would you like to say?
Hey, James.
Hello.
Like a lot of people, I'm a long-time listener, and I felt like I'd call in on a topic that I feel is important enough.
Good man.
And I'd say I'm full tin hat when it comes to AI. And that I believe it is the most important conversation we can be having today.
That's not tin hat.
I think a lot of people overestimate just how dangerous it can be.
Sure.
And I'd like to take a crack at the existential threat angle of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in addition to the previous caller, it's not simply about just cyber warfare and chemical warfare. It's about the redistribution of power to regular people, because the extension of things like ChatGPT and having a personal AI, in your pocket on your computer, is that you have access to vast amounts of knowledge. And, as the previous caller said, these AI are finding out new things all the time. They're researching genomes, they're looking at protein folding, they're looking at all these different ways, we can find medicines. But it just lumped in with that. You don't even have to be looking for it. If you look at 7,000 genome sequences, you're going to find some new diseases. You're going to find some new ways to make weapons. And it just comes out in the wash of finding out all this useful, interesting stuff.
Yikes.
But ultimately what it means, because realistically, I think Oppenheimer was eye-opening for a lot of people if you've seen it, and you can see all the work and effort that went into creating a nuclear bomb.
Yes.
And obviously, it's very powerful and devastating. And at a time, and for the time being, it's controlled by governments, and it's highly regulated, and it's very, very hard to do. But there's no rule in nature or the universe that incredibly dangerous things are automatically hard to make.
No.
And when you or I or anyone has the ability, all access to all human knowledge, in our pocket, and in a population of, say, London or wherever, you get the occasional maniac, you get the occasional person who just wants to do ill. And with all the access to knowledge, it's very hard to prevent somebody, because what all AI does is it lowers the gap of, competence that you need to do these really incredible things, but also really incredibly dangerous things.
That's a very good way of putting it. It just takes the sweat out of it, doesn't it? Really, it takes the sweat and the brains and the hours and the graft, and it allows you to almost hack knowledge. And most obviously, in the context of existential threat, we're talking about the creation of bioweapons.
Yeah, and you see this, and you can see it because what a lot of people do, they look at the angle of jobs, and you see, there's a little bit of a threat now with software engineers, because stuff like ChatGPT can code. It can create code on its own. If I want to write a nice application in the afternoon, I can get ChatGPT to do that for me. Yeah. And it means, this once arcane bit of knowledge where, only software developers and engineers, and they have to do a lot of schooling and education, I can now do it. But in the same vein, I could write a virus if I wanted to. And, we look at it from a job perspective.
So that's cyber attacks. Sorry, that was the bit I got confused about, but you're absolutely right. So cyber attacks and biochemical attacks, you frighten the life out of me, to be honest, Lawrence.
Yeah, I mean, it's frightening, and this is what I mean. There isn't a way to sugarcoat it. And I'm, skeptical of our government, any government's ability to get ahead of it, because it is a new ballpark entirely. You don't know what the threats are before they happen, with a large respect to a lot of these things. But the power of AI, and as I said before, it's discovering new knowledge all the time. Things that
and no one's going to be able to control it then.
It's one of those things where the likelihood is that you'd have to use AI to come up with ways to think about how to stop AI. But yeah, it's incredibly difficult, because once that power gets distributed, and it is to an extent, I use it in my day to day. I use it as a personal assistant at work. It helps me a lot. A lot of people I know do. But it
can
makes
I ask
a lot
what you
of
do?
things.
What do you use it for? Do you mind me asking?
I work in projects for a vehicle company.
Okay.
It's just it's really it helps with it helps come up with ideas sometimes.
Fair enough.
Which is quite helpful.
Let's start getting it to come up with topics for the show.
You could. You absolutely can. But yeah,
First time for everything.
Exactly. So yeah, there's the angle, and yeah, I don't necessarily know that this is what Sunak is on about when he says,
I think it must be. I think it must be. I mean, because you've explained it really clearly. So you could create. Yesterday, the government warned that AI could be used to create bioweapons, and that humans could lose control of the software. So I mean, you almost bring up Bond villain stuff, don't you? So because you would have governments that have agreed to abide by certain rules and guidelines, and quite strict rules in place on access and availability, but you get a Bond villain who rides roughshod over all of it in order to...
That's exactly right. And you have it's fine if we agree with America and China and whoever. Yes, we as a government won't do this, but any bad actor has the capability to do quite destructive things.
And what do I need in order to access all of it? How I mean, forgive me, this is quite a daft question, but I don't know the answer to it. Would I only need a smartphone, or would I need a very big computer?
At the minute, you would use your smartphone, but that's because they're on cloud services. I'm using other people's processing. I'm using other people's software, but it's not beyond the wit of man to see that even in a couple of years, I could. It's perfectly affordable. Maybe I spend $10,000 on processing power, but
that's what you'd need in a few years' time. Okay, so I mean, in terms of getting ahead of it, what might that look like? Do you have any idea?
Getting ahead of it realistically, so you have things at the minute like ChatGPT, which are owned by organizations, but the code is open source to an extent, so anyone can make their own. Restricting. At the minute, these things have restrictors on what they are capable of doing. They have their own
built-in
it has its own parameters.
Built-in restrictors. So we'd need to be doing more on that. Thank you, Lawrence. I'm going to squeeze in one more call because Gareth works in cybersecurity. So and I'm already short of time, but that's the only reason. I just think it might sit neatly alongside what you've just told us. Gareth, over to you.
Yeah, hi, James. A lot of good sense spoken by your previous caller there, I think. A couple of points I was going to mention as well. I think we shouldn't be scared of AI, though. I think the areas that we should perhaps consider are what are the unique characteristics of AI. Ultimately, it's just a tool, isn't it? And it's how you use it, same as any other tool. But I think if we start getting into the space where we allow automated decisioning from AI, then perhaps that's a new frontier, isn't it? So what's the authority levels that we start to put around the controls? But in terms of cybersecurity, my sort of area, I think one of the areas of concern, I guess, and areas of interest is the ability to crack encryption. So if you can imagine, we rely on encryption for all secure communications over technology, whether that's buying something online or communicating on the battlefield, perhaps.
Yes.
Well, if you can crack that encryption, then that, of course, means that communications are open and you can understand all the implications.
As with what the last chap was telling us, it's about sucking the hard work out of it. So you wouldn't need Alan Turing and Bletchley Park. You could just have one person with a computer doing the same thing in a fraction of the time.
I think that's right. And also bear in mind, if you can record all encrypted traffic today and then you can replay that at some point in the future and decrypt it, then all of those communications, everything that's being said currently can be exposed, and that has.
This is right. In its simplest terms, the best thing society, media, politicians can do is talk about it a lot. Get it all out there, and work with it, move forward. So in terms of getting in front of it, it's not an impossible dream, as you remind us. Don't be frightened. The more you know about it, the less easy you will be to spook, because there's always people benefiting from spooking you. And I don't want to be one of those people. If I say something that sounds spooky, it's because I'm spooked. It's not because I'm commoditizing your fear for my own personal advancement or profit, which leads us back to the anti-vaxxers, of course. Thank you, Gareth. That's it from me for another day. We will be doing it all again tomorrow morning from 10. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player. You can rewind live radio. You can enjoy the whole show podcast. You can find all of LBC's shows to catch up, and you can stay up to date with the latest news from LBC. So rewind live radio on Global Player. Free to download from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4. Sheila Fogarty with you now. 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 Sheila Fogarty with